Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kieran Tobin, and this is Richard's 6th book on the Alexander technique. And I'm very honoured that he asked me to speak here at the launch today. I'm a great fan of the Alexander technique. As it's administered to me by Richard, and to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude. Now, I have passed my 60th year. I always say, when anybody asks me what age I am, I say I'm turning 60, slowly. Okay? You work that one out for yourselves, okay? But just in case I get a senior moment, I've made a few notes, okay? Frederick Alexander was born in 1869 and died in 1955. That's about as much as I know of him, really, because Richard gave me one of his books, one of the books that Alexander himself had written, and I found it virtually incomprehensible. Richard has, however, made the whole thing very clear, very concise, and very understandable. Alexander was unwell as a youth and from a relatively poor family, and in his 20s, however, he decided that he wished to become an actor. He was born in Australia. As an actor, he really became a reciter. He did one-man shows doing Shakespearean recitals. So his voice was what was important to him. And as the years went by, he began to get troubles with his voice. Now, dysphonia is the word we would give to disorders of the voice, disorders of phonation, dysphonia. And the voice is very carefully brought to us by our larynx, the voice box. The muscles in the voice box are very, very delicate and very numerous. Pardon me. Very many. And the control of them is very precise and very concise. It's very easy to lose control of the voice. It's amazing that so many of us can speak relatively freely, because it's very easy to strain the voice. And Alexander developed dysphonia. Dysphonia is one of the symptoms of voice problems would be hoarseness, and we're all familiar with that. You get a cold and your voice goes a bit rough and a bit hoarse like this. Okay, but dysphonia is more a lack of control. The voice becomes a bit difficult to manage like this, and eventually it can become quite strangled and disappear. And this is what happened to Alexander. And there is no medical cure as such for dysphonia. And he was given the time-honoured treatment of doing nothing. In other words, rest your voice for quite some time. And it helped for a time, but not for too long. And then he began to experiment himself to try and bring his voice back, because his livelihood depended on it. And he found that various ways in which he held himself and so on were interfering with the production of his voice. And it's a long story, and it goes on for several years as he cured himself. And when he did, several people asked him for help with their voices, and it went on from there. And he became a teacher, basically, of voice problems, and he became a teacher of posture and so on, because he came up with the concept of what he called the primary control. The basis of it was to maintain the head cleanly on the neck, and that everything then would behave itself, as it were, from there on down. Okay, and this was his basic finding, and it seemed to work for him, and he went on from there to treat very many people. Now, I asked Richard, because I go to Richard, and I asked him whether I was a patient or a client, or what I was. I mean, I was hoping he'd just well, anyway, he said I was a pupil, that he's a teacher of this technique. It's not a therapy, it's a technique, and he was teaching me how to apply it to myself. Conventional medicine is an art. It's not a science. We like to think that it's a science, but it's not. And despite the huge developments over the years, we still can't cure the common cold, you know. So really, it's a lot of medicine is allaying person's concerns whilst the body heals itself. And this was certainly the way I dealt with a lot of problems when I was a surgeon. I dealt with a lot of problems in this way, in helping people to accept their problems whilst nature executed a cure. Now, of course, somebody gets cancer or something serious, okay, surgery is required, medicine is required. But in the main, the body will look after itself to a large extent. But we're discussing posture and not diseases. And posture to me is the relationship of the various parts of my body whilst at rest and whilst in activity. And we really are amazingly designed. I mean, it astounds me that the body doesn't give more trouble. I think it's a wonderful design, and it's been evolving over millions of years. It's still evolving. There's a muscle, for instance, in the forearm, disappearing and will be gone in 200 years' time. It's disappearing because it helped the middle finger to keep cooked up like this so that we could hang out the trees. And most of us probably don't need it anymore. Speaking for myself anyway, okay. But the design can be abused, and that's what happens. We abuse our design, okay, and that's why we get troubles. Neck and back problems seem to be very common. The statistics are appalling. And Richard's book will tell us that basically we're the architects of our own misfortune. We bring it upon ourselves. Not necessarily our own faults as such. We've been schooled to it, okay? But he explains why we get pain in our back. He explains that it's repetitive misuse of the muscles controlling our stature, our posture, our positioning. And that basically back pain is rarely bony in origin, but mainly muscular, I'm sorry. According to Richard and Alexander, it starts in our younger years. It starts in school days when we bent over the desk, and then it continues on into our later schooling and possibly into our work years with the abnormal positions that we put ourselves in. And Richard will explain that chairs are badly designed and footwear is badly designed, and a lot of the things that we use at our work are badly designed. However, the nice thing is that in his book he reassures us that we can be brought back to a comfort position, and that's what I like to get from the book. The Alexander technique then is being taught to us by the Alexander teachers, and is to try and get us to unlearn the bad habits we've developed over the years and to re-educate our musculature. If you think of holding a peculiar position, let's say that you move your head off to one side like this and hold it for a long period of time, you will get pain, and the pain is not in the bone but in the muscle. Muscle activity is dependent on oxygen and nutrients. And when these come together and the muscle moves and acts and works, it leaves a chemical residue, lactic acid, and this is painful in the tissues. And so if the muscle is overused or badly used or misused, we're left with pain, and that's where the pain from our necks, in our necks, and so on, basically comes from. Now, I spent my working years with my neck a lot of my time bent over like this and in quite an uncomfortable and abnormal position. And over the years I developed a great deal of pain in my neck and in my shoulders. I had colleagues in my own discipline. I had colleagues who'd had surgery to their neck, colleagues who had lack of sensation in the fingers here on the side from nerve entrapment, and I accepted pain as part of my working life. I just accepted it, and that was it. And I treated myself with painkillers and anti-inflammatories. And then I retired. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to become pain-free now. But unfortunately, I didn't. I got worse. I lost mobility in my neck so that I could barely turn like this. I then began to lose mobility in my thorax, so that I was very, very discommoded by this. I went to various doctors, but I eventually had an MRI done because we were convinced that I must have some disc problem in the neck, and nothing showed up. There was absolutely no abnormality. So I was sent for physiotherapy. And no disrespect to physiotherapists, they do a great job, but it didn't work for me. I had physiotherapy on many sessions, and I would get temporary relief, but very little more than that. And so I gave it up. It's as simple as that. I continued to use anti-inflammatories and so on. And then, fortunately, I met a former male nurse whom I knew from the hospital. And he said, "You're looking very stressed and very tensed, Kieran." And I said, "Well, you know, I have back problems and so on." And he said, "Well, why don't you go to the Alexander Technique teacher?" And he gave me Richard's name, and I went to Richard. And after a period of time, I found that my mobility was back, right? Thorax, neck, the whole thing, and I was pain-free. And I have to say, it was absolutely marvellous to do so, like to be so. Now, Richard explains in his book that we're often very much unaware of the awkward positions that we adopt, the awkward posture that we adopt. And certainly I realised that this was the case because in looking back over old photographs, I noted that I tended to keep my head off to one side. And I became aware of this, but I realised that if I tried to straighten my head, I got pain. So I had become accustomed to an abnormal position. And I just want to quote from Richard's book, in which he quotes from Irish philosopher Edmund Burke in the 1700s. "I look in the mirror, and what do I see? A strange-looking person that cannot be me. For I am much taller, not nearly so fat, as that man in the mirror that I'm looking at. Oh, where are the mirrors that I used to know, like the ones which were made 30 years ago? Now all things have changed, and I'm sure you'll agree, mirrors are not as good as they used to be. So be not concerned if stoops appear, for one thing I've learned which is very clear. Should your posture be less than perfection, it must be the mirror that needs correction." Now, unfortunately, it isn't the mirror, right? But there is relief. And for that I thank Richard, I thank him for his expertise, and I thank him and congratulate him for his book, and I hope it does very well. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Kieran. Either I didn't pay attention in class because I don't think I would have explained it as concisely and as straightforwardly as that, or else Richard didn't explain it to us. But it's actually really wonderful to hear that story, particularly coming from the experience and expertise that Kieran has. Ordinarily, when any of us as teachers mention that we are teachers of the Alexander Technique, people immediately go like this. They straighten up. And unfortunately, that's entirely the wrong thing to do. It took Richard quite a while to instill the idea in my head that you do nothing. And at one level this was really attractive, but at another level it was quite scary, because the idea of doing nothing when you're a workaholic doesn't sit well. I came to the Alexander Technique when my back had gone into spasm for an innumerable time, as it had done over the previous 30 years. I very stupidly took up rugby at the age of 17, and the only position that was left was tight head forward, and I didn't know what it entailed, but I soon found out. And what it entailed was an awful lot of thumping and kicking and pulling and dragging, and a scrum collapse. And the scrum collapse was most uncomfortable, and I was barely able to move after it, but it was the time before physios and these magic sprays, and I was told, get on with it, and I did. And about 5 years later, I was married, and we had our first child, and we were about to go into town, and he was dressed and ready to go, but he had kicked off his shoes, and I bent down to put on his shoes. And you should not do that if you've been caught with scrum collapse. My wife had unfortunately gone up, we were living on Blanche Island at the time. She'd gone up the village to see some friends to see if they wanted anything, because we were going to drive into Carsavine. And in my pain, I made my way upstairs, got on the bed, and that was even more painful, so I then had to find some way of getting off the bed, which was something about reversing your way down, and got off the bed and headed downstairs, or so I thought, until I came to the edge of the stairs and realised I was now at right angles leading out over the stairs, so you can't do that. And I went into reverse to go down the stairs on my hands and knees, got down the stairs, and my wife and my friends arrived back and saw me and held each other up in laughter. They thought it was hilarious. And I'm bent double in the middle of the footpath. I was somehow put into the car, driven into Carsavine, into the doctor's surgery, which was full that afternoon, and all I can see is all these feet parting like the Red Sea, apparently in Bible times. They all just parted by, and I went into the doctor and became acquainted with the procedure, which is drop your trousers, you get a shot in the ass, your leg goes numb, and because we were down there and he had an aga, he put me lying on the floor in his kitchen with my back up against the aga to warm it, and his Labrador came and lay on my chest. And it went on pretty much like this for 30 years. The Labrador changed, and it went for the nth time. I unfortunately this time was in the bath, and there is no way you can do this with any sort of dignity. I was in the bath, the water was getting cold, and I reached forward to turn on the hot tap, and bang, it went. And I called out, my wife came in and said, oh, for God's sake, not again, here we go. And people sort of lose sympathy for you the longer you go on with this. And eventually, somehow, I don't know, I managed to get out of the bath, dripping all over the place, and honestly, that was just the tears. And the doctor arrived, and I got the shot in the ass, and a couple of days later, I saw this catalogue of adult education courses, and at the very back of the catalogue was listed University of Limerick, lifelong learning, Alexander Technique, and I thought, my God, that's got something to do with backs. So I signed up and I went for it. And the second day we were there at 10 o'clock in the morning, Richard had given us the whole spiel, and I was thinking, oh, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know, who is Alexander? And he said, would anybody like to try this? Has anybody got anything they want to deal with? And this other young lady of about 40, 45 said, I would like to. She said, I have a pain in my hip for the last 7 or 8 years. And all that's happening is it's getting worse and worse. And I'm getting bigger and bigger doses of painkillers and anti-inflammatories and stuff to my stomach. And he's soon going to have to put me on antidepressants, because the last time I was into him, he told me I'd have to have surgery, but I'm too young yet. So I'm going to have to live with this until they're all ready. And Richard said, okay, well, come up here and let's see what we can do for you. And we were all sitting in a big circle of chairs. There was about 20 people there. And he said very briefly, you know, have you taken your medication this morning? She said, I have. And on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the pain level? She said 7.5, 8. Highly effective painkillers, obviously. And he said, "Are you standing the way you normally stand?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you standing upright?" She said, "Yes." And he said to us, "Is she standing upright?" And we all looked at her for the first time and said, "No, you're over here in your hip." And she said, "No, I'm not, I'm standing upright." And we said, "Well, 20 of us are seeing you and you're over there in your hip." And she was getting a little bit touchy about the whole thing. You know, hardly 2 or 3 minutes, he had brought her into this absolutely perfect alignment. And her head was over her shoulders and over her hips and over her knees. And he said to her, "How is this?" And she said, "It's very good." I thought, okay, I must talk to this lady. And at the coffee break, I said, "So do you know Richard well?" And she said, "I've never met him before." Come on, you surely have met him before. And she said, "No, never met him before," because I was convinced he'd slipped her 50 quid or something. Honestly, and as we worked through the rest of the morning, I decided by lunchtime I'm going to learn this. And that was in November. I came up to the school in December, and I started training in January. And I can assure you it has been the best career move I've made. And I've made a few over the years. They were quite disastrous. But this one has really proven to be very, very, very good. It is amazing that we can become so far away from ourselves, so far away from our bodies, that we don't notice how badly off we are. It was interesting when Kieran said, you know, you can get used to the pain in your neck and you're over here, but when you go to straighten it hurts, so you get back. And we all do it. You know, I did it for 30 years. I had hurt my back, and I learned to stand like this to protect it. And he said, "Could you stand like that?" And I said, "That's stupid. I'm going to fall." And this is the constant story, because we get moved out of this comfort zone that we have built for ourselves, but it's actually an illusion. It's actually just covering up pain, and until we come in and release it, we're pretty well left with it. It is wonderful that Richard decided to come to Ireland, that he decided to come to Galway, and that he was available when I certainly needed the sort of input that he has been making available. And I know that this is the story with all of the teachers who have been through the school over the years. So it's my special pleasure to introduce Richard.
First of all, thank you very much all for coming. I'm not going to speak for too long, but I would like to say a few words of why I wrote the book, because I myself, like Kieran and like Niall, was in a lot of pain for a long time. At the age of 21, I really didn't know what to do in form of career. And then I saw an advert in the paper, and it said driving instructor wanted, and what really attracted me was you can take the car home in the evening. And at the time I didn't have a car, and I thought, well, I could do that for about 6 months and save up for a car. And that was my total motivation. Okay. After about 3 or 4 years of teaching people to drive, I started to get a niggly back. It was just uncomfortable, and then the niggly back became much more of a back problem. I mentioned it to my father, who was an excellent GP, and he sent me to many people consultants, physios, all the rest of it. But in the next 5 or 6 years, it just got from bad to worse until I probably could just manage 3 or 4 stairs at a time. And I was in constant pain with sciatica. After a while, I gave up the physio, and I gave up the orthopaedic surgeon, and I gave up because all they wanted to do was to remove the 3 bottom discs. They said it wouldn't help my mobility, but at least there would be less pain. But when I talked about it with my father, he actually said, look, whatever you do, don't have the operation, because I see the people afterwards. Okay? And then I thought, well, I'll dive into the complementary, or like anything that anybody who said would help my back. Chiropractor, osteopath, even people like Reiki healers, and you name it. If somebody said, I've got a solution for your back, then I would actually go there. And after about 5 or 6 years of doing that, I resigned myself to a life of pain, and it was excruciating, and it was there pretty much all the time, even lying down. And then somebody said to me, have you tried the Alexander technique? Of which I said, what's that? Because in context I'd heard of it, but it was something musicians did or actors did. I didn't know quite why they did it. So it was a bit like somebody saying, have you tried Tesco's? Okay? Basically. I was just completely, I didn't know what they were talking about. And within maybe 15 minutes of my first Alexander lesson, the actual teacher said, do you always sit like that? And I said very defensively, sit like what? And then they just brought a mirror over, and I was actually sitting about 20 degrees over to the left and twisting about 15 degrees forward. And I hadn't realised that I was actually sitting like that. So he just got my head and he put it over my shoulders and over my body, and 2 things happened. In the same way Niall is saying, I felt way, way over to the left. And the other thing that actually happened is the pain went. And then after my first lesson, I'd realised that when you teach people to drive, you have to sit on the side because you have to look at the road and see them in the mirror. And all I've been doing for the last maybe 10 years was sitting really awkwardly in the car. And that has actually put a lot of pressure on the discs and the nerves and all the rest of it. And I was totally amazed by the revelation. And when I learned to sit more squarely and more aligned, the pain just went completely. And I just wish I'd known about that 7 years previously, because it could have saved me a lot of pain and it could have saved me a lot of trouble. It didn't take me long to decide that's what I wanted to do and become. So for me, the book is a way of maybe getting the message out for anyone in pain. It could be a neck problem, it could be a back problem, it could be a breathing problem, it could be indigestion problem, because muscles actually account for about half your body weight. So when you have muscular tension, it can manifest in a great many different ways. It can also manifest in depression, because if the muscles start pulling me down, I actually physically get depressed. And that can lead to a mental feeling of feeling down. We often say, oh, I feel down. Okay, well, our body goes up and down depending on the muscles pulling it down, and yeah. So there's a few people I would actually like to thank. First of all, like I was saying in the first place, thank you everybody for coming along. I'd like to thank Charlie for putting the launch on. Thank you very much. I'd definitely like to thank Kieran for coming along. I think I was saying earlier, I think it was 1934 since a surgeon has actually publicly stood up and said something in favour of the Alexander technique. So it's a long time, so I really appreciate that. I'd like to thank Niall for presenting the evening. I'd like to thank Thomas as well, because he's been brilliant, giving me little tips of how to promote the technique and how to contact the papers, and so I appreciate that. Right. And I'd like to also thank Caroline. The main thing I'd like to think about is the technical support, getting the posters out. She proofread the book, and I tell you, that is something that needs a medal for. Okay. Because I can't spell and I can't put sentences together very well. So, yeah, it does take a very long time. So, thank you all for coming. It's a great turnout, and appreciate everyone who's made the effort. Okay, thank you.